Frank Mitchell had always believed that dinner was where families told the truth. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet truths that slipped out between bites when people were too tired to pretend. That night, the dining room felt stage table set perfectly. Wine poured before he asked, Olivia sitting straighter than usual. The smell of roasted chicken hung in the air, but Frank's appetite never quite arrived. They were halfway through the meal when Olivia reached into her leather folder. She didn't look at Frank at first. She placed the papers on the table like they were nothing more than a receipt. "Dad," she said softly, the word careful on her tongue, "there's something we should take care of tonight." Frank wiped his mouth, eyes drifting to the stack of documents. Thick, official, the kind that came with consequences. Take care of what? Olivia slid the top page toward him. Power of attorney. The words sat there, bold and final, as if they'd been waiting for him. "It's just a precaution," she said quickly, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "With your health, we all worry this makes things easier. For you." Frank felt a tightening in his chest. Not pain, not yet, but instinct. He glanced at Angela, hoping for a look of reassurance. She gave him a small nod, the kind meant to calm, not convince. Kyle kept eating, eyes on his plate, jaw working like this conversation wasn't happening at all. "My health is fine," Frank said. "I had a checkup last month." Olivia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Of course, but things change. Doctors, banks, emergencies. This protects you, protects the family." The word family landed heavier than it should have. Frank had built everything on that word. The house, the accounts, the future. Kyle now lived inside without ever asking how it was paid for. He picked up the document, scanning lines that felt intentionally dense. Legal language had a way of hiding sharp edges. "This gives you control," he said, looking at Olivia. "A lot of it." "Only if you need it," she replied instantly. Too instantly. "And only to help." Silence followed. Kyle still hadn't looked up. "Kyle," Frank said. "You want to say something?" Kyle shrugged, finally meeting his eyes. "Dad, you're overthinking it. It's just paperwork. Olivia's right. That should have eased him. Instead, it did the opposite." A knock came at the door before Frank could respond. Olivia stood immediately. "That'll be the notary." Frank hadn't agreed to that part. He hadn't even known. His unease deepened as Diana Carter stepped inside, professional smile in place, briefcase in hand. She introduced herself, calm, efficient, already flipping open forms as if the decision had been made hours ago. As Diana explained the process, Frank felt cornered by politeness, by expectations, by the quiet pressure of being the only one resisting something everyone else had clearly agreed on. "Mr. Mitchell," Diana said gently, pointing to the signature line. "You're free to ask questions." Frank looked again at Olivia, at Kyle, at Angela, whose hands were folded too tightly in her lap. He thought of his age, the recent fatigue he hadn't admitted out loud, the way people had started speaking for him instead of to him. Trust had always been his currency. He had spent it freely with family. "Fine," he said at last, his voice steady despite the doubt clawing at him. "Let's do it." The pen felt heavier than it should have. As he signed, a strange chill moved through him, the sense of stepping across a line he wouldn't easily return from. Diana watched closely, her eyes flicking between faces, noticing the stiffness in the room, the silence where relief should have been. When it was done, Olivia gathered the papers quickly, thanking Diana with practiced warmth. Kyle pushed back his chair, already disengaging. Angela exhaled, as if something unavoidable had passed. Frank sat still, staring at his signature. Diana paused at the door, glancing back once more. She couldn't name what felt wrong, only that something had shifted in that house, something fragile and permanent. Frank didn't know it yet, but as the door closed behind the notary, the first piece of his control had already slipped out of reach. Frank barely slept that night. When morning light crept through the blinds, it didn't bring clarity, only repetition. The image replayed itself over and over. The document on the table, Olivia's steady voice, the pen in his hand. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, his mind circling the same question he hadn't been brave enough to ask out loud. Why did it have to happen so fast? At breakfast, Angela moved around the kitchen with deliberate calm, pouring coffee, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. Frank watched her from the table, noticing how carefully she avoided his eyes. Finally, he spoke. "I keep thinking about yesterday." Angela sighed softly and sat across from him. "Frank, you're worrying yourself sick. Olivia's just being proactive. You know how she is organized. Prepared." Prepared. That word stuck with him. "Prepared for what?" he asked. "I didn't even ask for that paperwork." Angela reached for his hand. "You've been tired lately. You forget things sometimes. She's just trying to help before something happens." Frank didn't pull his hand away, but he didn't squeeze back either. Help didn't usually come with surprises. It didn't arrive already, notarized. The reassurance settled on him like a thin blanket covering the doubt, but not warming it. Late morning, Olivia called. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I spoke to the bank," she said. "There are a few additional forms we should finalize. Just to make everything official." Frank leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Additional forms?" "Yes," she replied smoothly. "Standard stuff. Access permissions. Account continuity. It's easier if we handle it now while everything's fresh." Fresh. As if yesterday hadn't already left a bruise. "I'll take a look," Frank said carefully. "No rush." There was a pause, brief, but loaded. "Dad," Olivia said, her tone tightening just slightly. "This is about protecting you. Delaying only complicates things." After the call ended, Frank sat in silence, the unease now unmistakable. He'd built his life on instinct, on reading people when numbers and contracts didn't tell the whole story. That instinct was speaking now, louder than his need to keep the peace. He called Rachel Fields just before noon. She answered on the second ring. "Frank, everything okay?" He explained slowly, choosing his words with care. The dinner, the document, the notary, the push for more signatures. When he finished, Rachel didn't respond right away. "Frank," she said finally, "a power of attorney is serious, even when it comes from family, especially then." "So I'm not imagining this," he said. "No," she replied firmly, "and I'd advise you not to sign anything else until we review exactly what authority you've already granted." Relief mixed with something darker validation came with consequence. What if I already made a mistake? Rachel didn't sugarcoat it. "Then we slow things down. And we get informed. Trust doesn't mean surrender." After the call, Frank felt steadier, but the ground beneath him still felt unfamiliar. When Olivia emailed the new documents that afternoon flagged urgent, he didn't open them. An hour later, she texted, then called. "Did you see what I sent?" she asked. "Yes," Frank said. "And I'm not signing anything else right now." Her silence this time was longer. "Is someone putting ideas in your head?" "No," he replied. "Someone's helping me think." That night, as Frank stood alone in his study, he caught his reflection in the darkened window. He looked older than he remembered, tired, vulnerable, and suddenly he wondered if that was exactly what everyone else had started seeing too. Not a father, not the man who built everything, just a problem to be managed. The thought settled heavily in his chest as he turned off the light, realizing for the first time that his health might not be the only thing being questioned, and that trust, once tested, rarely returns unchanged. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They slipped in quietly, disguised as convenience. Frank noticed it first with the mail. Statements that once landed on his desk now sat neatly stacked in Olivia's hands when she visited. Already opened, already summarized. "I went through these for you," she said one afternoon, placing them down with practiced efficiency. "Nothing urgent." Frank looked at the envelopes, his name printed clearly on the front, yet somehow no longer belonging solely to him. "You didn't ask," he said. Olivia smiled, light and controlled. "I didn't want to bother you." That word again. Bother. As if his own finances were an inconvenience. Soon it was appointments. A rescheduled meeting with the accountant he hadn't approved. A home maintenance decision already paid for, each time. Olivia explained it away, saving time, reducing stress, helping him focus on his health. And each time, the space where Frank's authority used to sit grew smaller. When he mentioned it to Kyle, the response came fast and dismissive. "Dad, you're reading too much into it," Kyle said, leaning back on the couch, phone in hand. You're not as sharp as you used to be. Olivia's just stepping up. The words stung more than Frank expected. I didn't ask her to step up, he replied. Kyle sighed, the sound edged with impatience. That's the point. You shouldn't have to anymore. Frank stared at his son, searching for something familiar, something loyal. Instead, he saw distance, comfort, a quiet acceptance of being relieved of responsibility as long as it wasn't his responsibility being taken. By the end of the week, Olivia's presence felt constant, not loud, not forceful, just everywhere. She spoke for him on calls, answered questions directed at him, corrected him gently when he misstated a number or date. Each correction landed like a small erasure. Frank began keeping mental notes. What was new? What felt rushed? What hadn't been discussed? Suspicion didn't announce itself as certainty. It grew as awareness, as pattern. One evening, when the house was quiet and Angela had gone to bed early, Frank asked Olivia to stay behind. I want to talk, he said. She paused, then nodded, sitting across from him at the dining table where it had all begun. Of course. Frank folded his hands, steadying them. Have you been making decisions for me without telling me? Olivia didn't hesitate. I've been helping, she said. There's a difference. I didn't say helping, Frank replied. I said deciding. Her smile softened, almost maternal. Frank, you've been overwhelmed. Everyone sees it. I'm just handling the details so you don't have to. That's not your call to make. She leaned forward slightly. It is when someone needs support. The words were gentle. The implication was not. Frank held her gaze, searching for a crack. You're moving fast. Because things can change fast, Olivia answered. Health does. Capacity does. I'm thinking ahead. For whose benefit? He asked. For yours, she said immediately. Too immediately. And for Kyle's. For the family. Frank nodded slowly, though the unease remained. Reassurance without transparency felt like control dressed as concern. When Olivia finally left, he stayed at the table long after, the house feeling larger, emptier. Isolation crept in quietly after that. Conversations shifted when he entered rooms. Decisions were presented as updates, not discussions. Angela tried to keep things calm, but even she deferred to Olivia more often now, as if momentum itself had chosen a direction. Frank began to wonder if this was how it happened, not through confrontation, but through gradual consent, through the assumption that slowing down meant stepping aside. A few days later, Diana returned to notarize an unrelated document Angela needed. As she worked, her eyes flicked toward Frank, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She noticed the way he hovered near the doorway, how he opened his mouth once as if to speak, then stopped. You all right, Mr. Mitchell? She asked casually. I'm fine, Frank said, forcing a smile. Diana nodded, professional as ever, but something in her expression tightened. She'd been trained to notice hesitation, to read discomfort without naming it. Still, this wasn't her place. She finished her work, gathered her things. As she left, she glanced back once more. Frank was still standing there, watching Olivia explain something to Angela with quiet authority. Diana couldn't say why, but the image stayed with her, the look of a man present in his own home, yet slowly being spoken around. Frank felt it too. The subtle shift had become unmistakable. And for the first time, he wondered how much of himself had already been decided away. The distance between Frank and Kyle didn't announce itself with shouting matches or slammed doors. It grew through tone, through timing, through the way Kyle now spoke to him like a difficult client instead of a father. Every conversation seemed to end the same way, Frank raising a concern, Kyle dismissing it with a tired sigh. Dad, this again? Kyle said one afternoon when Frank questioned a payment he didn't recognize. You're letting paranoia get the best of you. Paranoia. Frank felt the word settle in his chest like an accusation. I'm asking about my money, he replied. That's not paranoia. Kyle avoided his eyes. Olivia handles this stuff better. You know that. That was when Frank understood something fundamental had shifted. His authority hadn't been challenged head-on, it had been quietly reassigned. Olivia no longer asked before acting, she informed. Bills were paid early without his knowledge. Investments were adjusted for stability. She spoke in percentages and long-term planning, always circling back to his health, his stress, his need to rest. Each sentence carried the same unspoken message. You're no longer the right man for this. Frank felt himself shrinking inside his own life. Decisions arrived, fully formed, with explanations attached like footnotes. When he questioned them, Olivia remained calm, almost patient, as if waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. Angela tried to hold the line between them, stepping in when voices sharpened. "She's just trying to keep things running smoothly," Angela said one evening, hands raised gently. "Can we not turn this into a war?" But Frank could feel it already was one, just a quiet one, and he was losing ground by the day. He stopped arguing, stopped explaining. Withdrawal became his armor. At night, lying awake beside Angela, he replayed conversations, tracking what had been said and what hadn't. Trust, he realized, wasn't gone yet, but it was under review. That was when he made the call. The private investigator came recommended through an old business contact, someone Frank hadn't spoken to in years. They met at a small office across town, neutral and forgettable. "I just want clarity," Frank said, sliding over a folder with account details. "Nothing dramatic." The investigator nodded. "That's usually how these start." Days passed. Frank moved through them carefully, saying little, watching everything. Olivia's confidence continued to grow. Kyle barely checked in anymore. The house felt like it was hosting him, not the other way around. Then the call came. "There are irregularities," the investigator said. "Transfers you didn't authorize. Accounts you don't regularly access showing activity." Frank closed his eyes. "How much?" "Enough to raise concern," the man replied. "And enough to suggest planning." Frank asked for details, dates, patterns. The silence on the other end stretched longer than before. "The approvals trace back to access granted through your power of attorney," the investigator said carefully. Frank ended the call and sat alone in his study, hands resting flat on the desk. The room felt smaller, tighter. The truth didn't explode. It pressed in slowly, relentlessly. Suspicion hardened into shape. Kyle's dismissiveness, Olivia's urgency, the quiet redirection of authority. None of it had been accidental. That night, Frank watched Kyle laugh at something on his phone, watched Olivia move through the kitchen like she owned it outright. He felt grief before anger, a grief reserved for things lost before you realize they're gone. They're working together, he thought. The idea settled with chilling clarity. He didn't know yet how deep it went, didn't know what had been taken, or what was planned next, only that the people he trusted most had been standing on the other side of the table longer than he'd allowed himself to see. Frank knew he had to confront them. He just didn't know how to do it without tearing what little remained of his family apart. As he sat there, weighing words he hadn't spoken yet, one thing became clear. Whatever conversation came next would change everything, and there would be no easy way back once it began. Frank stared at the documents spread across his desk, the late afternoon light catching on the ink like a quiet accusation. He'd reviewed them 3 times already, each passed slower than the last, hoping fatigue or stress would explain what he was seeing. It didn't. The signatures were wrong. Close enough to pass at a glance, but not his. The slant was off, the pressure uneven. On one page, the power of attorney itself, the signature carried a hesitation Frank knew he never had. His hands trembled, not with confusion now, but with certainty. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't overreach. It was forgery. Frank didn't call ahead. He walked into the living room where Olivia and Kyle sat together, their heads bent toward a laptop, speaking in low, efficient tones. They looked up in unison when he entered. Olivia smiled first. "Dad?" Frank dropped the folder onto the coffee table. Papers slid out, spreading like evidence at a crime scene. "Explain this." Olivia's smile froze. Kyle's eyes darted down, then away. Frank picked up one page and held it out. "That's not my signature, and neither is that one, or that." Olivia stood slowly, her expression tightening. "Frank, you're mistaken." "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." She crossed her arms, defensive now. "You're under a lot of stress. Your memory." "Don't," Frank snapped, the word cutting sharper than he intended. "Don't turn this into my health." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, calm down." Frank turned to him, eyes burning. "You knew." The room fell silent. Kyle swallowed. "I didn't think it was like this," he said finally. "I thought it was temporary, just to keep things moving." Frank felt something break open in his chest. "You knew she signed my name." Kyle looked at Olivia, then back at his father. "I didn't stop her." Olivia stepped forward. "Because it was necessary," she said. "You were dragging your feet. Bills had to be paid. Accounts managed. Someone had to act." "Someone," Frank repeated hollow. "Not me." Her voice rose, frustration bleeding through control. "You're not seeing clearly anymore. I was protecting what you built." "You stole it," Frank said. Kyle rubbed his face, unable to meet Frank's eyes. "I thought it was better than watching everything fall apart." Frank felt devastation settle in layers. Not just betrayal, but coordination. Silence as consent. His own son choosing convenience over honesty. He turned away from them, suddenly exhausted. That night, he called Rachel. She listened without interrupting, then spoke with measured urgency. "Frank, this is criminal. You need to act now. File reports, lock accounts, revoke authority." Frank stared at the wall as she spoke. Legal action meant exposure. Courtrooms, headlines, Kyle on the opposite side of the room. "That's my son," he said quietly. "And this is your life," Rachel replied. They crossed a line. After the call ended, Frank sat alone in the dark, grief pressing harder than anger. He had raised Kyle to be better than this, taught him that integrity wasn't situational. And now here he was, choosing silence while his father was erased, one signature at a time. When Frank finally stood, his reflection in the window looked older, harder. He walked back into the living room where Olivia and Kyle waited, tense, braced. "I know what you did," Frank said evenly. "And I won't pretend anymore." Kyle opened his mouth, but Frank raised a hand. "This ends now." The words didn't promise forgiveness. They promised something else, something final. As Frank turned away, one truth echoed louder than the rest. Whatever came next would cost him his relationship with his son. But doing nothing would cost him everything. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee, a place built for disputes that never ended cleanly. Frank sat across from the desk, his hands folded, listening as the attorney laid out the facts in a voice stripped of emotion. "Revoking the power of attorney is possible," the lawyer said, tapping a pen against the file. "But recovering what's already been moved will be harder. We'll need to move fast." Frank nodded. Fast. Everything had happened fast except the moment he'd needed time. "And my son?" Frank asked. The lawyer hesitated. "If he's involved, he'll be treated as such." Frank signed the retainer without ceremony. Justice, he was learning, came with paperwork too. Within days, Olivia and Kyle responded. Not with apologies, with attorneys. Their lawyer's letter arrived thick with language about capacity, concern, and fiduciary duty. It painted Frank as confused, volatile, and unfit to manage his own affairs. Reading it, Frank felt his pulse spike. His chest tightened, a familiar pressure he ignored until it passed. Stress had become his constant companion, following him from room to room, from day to night. Sleep came in fragments. Meals went untouched. Angela noticed. "You're not eating," she said one morning, pushing a plate toward him. "I'm fine," Frank replied, though his voice betrayed him. She sat down across from him, eyes tired. "This is killing you. Maybe you should consider settling. Find a way to end this without destroying what's left of the family." Frank looked at her, really looked. She wasn't choosing sides. She was afraid. Afraid of hospitals, afraid of funerals, afraid of losing both her husband and her son to a war neither would truly win. "If I settle," Frank said quietly, "I tell them this was acceptable." Angela reached for his hand. "Or you tell them you love your son more than your pride." The words hurt because they were close to true. But not close enough. "This isn't pride," Frank said. "It's survival." As motions were filed and accounts frozen, Frank began to feel the weight of the system pressing down. Hearings delayed, requests denied. Olivia's lawyer argued control, stability, continuity. Every filing carried the same message. Frank was a problem to be managed. Some nights, Frank sat alone in his study, reading legal briefs he barely understood, wondering when the balance had tipped so far against him. He'd built companies, negotiated contracts, yet here, stripped of context, reduced to age and blood pressure, he felt powerless. Exhaustion crept into his bones. Still, each morning, he showed up, signed what his lawyer placed in front of him, answered questions, refused to step aside. He thought of Kyle often, of teaching him how to ride a bike, of late nights helping with college applications, of the pride he'd once felt watching him walk into adulthood. Now their communication came through attorneys filtered, sanitized, cold. The realization hurt more than the legal fees, more than the stress. This battle wasn't just about money anymore. It was about whether truth still mattered when family stood on the other side. One evening, after a particularly draining day, Frank stood at the bathroom sink, staring at his reflection. Dark circles, shallow breaths. A man worn thin by betrayal and bureaucracy. He knew the fight was costing him physically, emotionally. He felt it in his chest, in the quiet moments when fear whispered that this might end him before any judge did. But as he turned off the light and headed for bed, one resolve remained unbroken. If he stopped now, they wouldn't just keep his money. They'd keep his voice. And Frank Mitchell wasn't ready to lose that, no matter the cost. Frank chose the setting carefully. Not a lawyer's office, not a courtroom. The living room, the same space where birthdays had been celebrated and holidays stretched late into the night. He wanted no doubt about what was being lost. Olivia arrived first, composed, her posture rigid with control. Kyle followed minutes later, tension written across his face. Frank stood when they entered, a quiet signal that this wasn't a discussion, it was a reckoning. "I want the truth," Frank said, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. "No lawyers, no excuses. You explain yourselves." Olivia crossed her arms, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Frank, this is exactly what I mean," she said calmly. "You're agitated. You've been under extreme stress. Your health—" "Stop," Frank said, not loud, final. "My health didn't sign my name." Kyle exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together. "Dad, nobody was trying to hurt you. You don't understand how bad things were getting." Frank turned to him. "Then help me understand." Kyle looked at the floor. "You were slowing down. Decisions took weeks. Money just sat there. Olivia said we needed to protect what you built." "And you agreed?" Frank said. Kyle nodded. "I thought it was temporary. I thought you'd come around." The admission felt heavier than any accusation. Frank's throat tightened, grief rising where anger had once lived. "So, you chose silence." "I chose family," Kyle shot back. "I chose us." Olivia stepped in quickly. "Exactly. Everything we did was for stability. You weren't thinking clearly, Frank. Someone had to." Frank reached into the folder he'd brought and placed a single document on the table. "This revokes the power of attorney. Effective immediately." Olivia stiffened. Kyle's head snapped up. "You can't do that." "I already have," Frank said. "All accounts are frozen. Access revoked. There will be no more decisions made in my name." Kyle's face flushed with anger. "You're cutting us out? After everything?" Frank met his son's gaze, pain clear but contained. "I'm cutting out the lies." "You don't know what loyalty is," Kyle snapped. "Family doesn't do this. You're abandoning us." Frank swallowed hard. "Family doesn't steal." The silence that followed felt permanent. Olivia said nothing now, her control slipping just enough to reveal calculation beneath. Kyle paced, fists clenched. The boy Frank raised replaced by someone he barely recognized. "I won't be manipulated anymore," Frank said. "Not by guilt, not by fear, not by pretending this was love." From the doorway, Diana stood unnoticed, having arrived to retrieve paperwork Angela had requested earlier. She didn't interrupt. She didn't move. She watched as a family came undone, not through shouting, but through truth spoken too late. Kyle stopped pacing. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. Frank nodded once. "I already do." As Olivia turned away, her silence louder than any defense, Frank felt the final thread snap. The room, once full of life, now held only aftermath. Diana's eyes met Frank's for a brief moment. There was no judgment there, only recognition. Some fractures don't heal. They expose. And as the door closed behind his son, Frank knew the fight ahead wasn't just legal. It was personal and far from over. The call came early, before Frank had fully shaken off sleep. His lawyer's voice was clipped, careful. "They filed for a restraining order," she said. "Temporary. It limits your access to several accounts and properties until the hearing." Frank sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to his ear, the room suddenly too quiet. "On what grounds?" Financial interference. Allegations that you're acting erratically. Erratic. The word felt rehearsed. He thanked her, ended the call, and stared at the floor as the meaning settled in. Even after everything, after the confrontation, after the revocation, they were still moving faster than him, still framing the narrative. By mid-morning, the pressure in his chest returned, heavier this time. His hands shook slightly as he poured coffee, the cup rattling against the saucer. He ignored it at first, then couldn't. His body was betraying him now too, responding to stress with blunt honesty. For the first time since this began, fear edged past anger. Not fear of losing money, but of losing agency, of waking up one day and being told officially that he was no longer capable of deciding anything for himself. Angela found him sitting at the kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling between his hands. "You don't look good," she said. "They're locking me out," Frank replied. "Legally." She closed her eyes, frustration spilling through exhaustion. "Frank, this is spiraling. Can't you see that? You're getting worse. This fight is tearing you apart." "So I should let them win?" "I'm saying maybe you should talk to them," she said. "For the family, for Kyle." Frank looked up at her. "You think this ends if I give in?" "I think it ends if you stop pushing," she answered, voice breaking. "I don't want to lose my husband to a court case." Her words landed deep. That afternoon, alone in his study, Frank asked himself the question he'd been avoiding. Is this worth it? The stress, the damage, the possibility that his health might not hold. Then the letter arrived. Olivia's handwriting was neat, deliberate, the tone measured, almost compassionate. She wrote about intentions, about misunderstandings, about how everything she'd done was to protect the family from instability. She suggested mediation, healing, moving forward before more harm is done. Frank read it twice. The justifications were familiar now, care framed as control, concern used as leverage. Still, a part of him searched for remorse, found none. That night, he stood by the window, watching the lights of the neighborhood blink on one by one. He thought of Kyle as a boy, running toward the house after school, of promises made without contracts, of trust that didn't require witnesses. Was reconciliation possible? Maybe, but not without truth, not without accountability. The next day brought more filings, more restrictions. The legal battle tightened, narrowing his options, increasing the stakes. Yet something unexpected happened inside Frank as the pressure mounted. Clarity. They weren't trying to fix this. They were trying to finish it. Frank straightened, the trimmer in his hands settling into resolve. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer back. "No more delays," he said. "We push forward." As he hung up, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became focus, purpose. They had underestimated him, his age, his limits, his willingness to endure. And as the fallout spread, one truth hardened in Frank's mind. If he didn't fight now, he would never truly belong to his own life again. Frank first heard his name on the radio while driving to a medical appointment. The announcer didn't say it with malice, just familiarity, the kind that comes when a story has already circulated enough to feel owned by everyone except the people living it. Sources close to the family say concerns have been raised about the patriarch's mental state. Frank turned the volume down, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. By the time he reached the clinic, his phone was buzzing with missed calls. Old colleagues, distant relatives, people who hadn't spoken to him in years, suddenly curious. By the afternoon, the story was everywhere. Not details, implications. Whispers framed as concern. Headlines that leaned on words like fragile, declining, disputed control. His life, reduced to speculation. Olivia and Kyle didn't deny it. They fed it. A carefully worded statement appeared online that evening, attributed to family representatives. It spoke about love, safety, and difficult decisions made in the best interest of an aging father. It didn't name Frank directly, but it didn't need to. The implication did the work. Angela watched the coverage in silence, arms wrapped around herself. "They're making you sound dangerous," she said finally. "Unstable," Frank replied. "That's the word they want." She looked at him, eyes tired, torn. "I don't know how much more of this I can take. Everywhere I go, people stare. They ask questions." Frank felt the weight of her loyalty pressing against the weight of her fear. He wanted to shield her, to make it stop, but stopping meant surrendering the truth to the loudest voice. At the grocery store the next day, Conversations quieted as he passed. At the bank, a clerk hesitated before addressing him, voice overly careful. Humiliation arrived in small, cumulative moments, each one chipping away at the man he'd spent decades building. Still, Frank didn't hide. He walked. He showed up. He answered what he could with dignity and left the rest unanswered. Pride, he knew, wasn't stubbornness. It was refusal to be erased. Rachel called that evening. "Do not respond to any of this," she said firmly. "They want you emotional, distracted. Focus on the case." "They're rewriting my life," Frank said. "They're trying," Rachel replied. "But courts don't run on headlines." Frank ended the call and sat alone. The house too quiet now. Invitations stopped coming. Friends grew cautious. Isolation crept in, not as loneliness, but as exclusion. He wondered what people would remember if this ended badly. The companies he'd built? The integrity he'd fought for? Or just the image being broadcast now, a man losing control while his family stepped in to clean up the mess? The question haunted him as the media attention intensified. A local reporter left a message asking for comment. A national outlet followed. Each request felt like another hand pulling at him from a different direction. Yet beneath the noise, something solid remained. Frank wasn't confused. He wasn't reckless. He was being challenged, and he was still standing. That night, as he turned off the television and the last talking head faded into static, Frank felt resolve settle deeper than doubt. They could question his mind, they could smear his name, but they couldn't force him to step aside. And as the spotlight burned brighter, Frank prepared himself for the truth that public battles don't forgive weakness, but they also don't break men who refuse to disappear. The pain didn't announce itself dramatically. It crept in as pressure, tight and unrelenting, squeezing Frank's chest while he sat alone in his study reviewing yet another legal brief. At first, he told himself it was stress, another wave of adrenaline, another sleepless night catching up with him. Then his left arm went numb. Frank tried to stand. The room tilted, the edges blurring as if the world itself were pulling away from him. He made it 2 steps before his knees gave out. The sound of his body hitting the floor felt distant, muffled, like it belonged to someone else. When he woke again, fluorescent lights burned overhead. Machines hummed softly, steady and indifferent. Angela sat beside the bed, her face pale, eyes rimmed red. "You had a heart attack," she said quietly, gripping his hand as if afraid he might disappear again. "A mild one, but it was real." Frank stared at the ceiling, the words sinking in slowly. Heart attack. The phrase carried finality he wasn't ready to accept. For the first time since this battle began, his body had drawn a line his will couldn't ignore. In the quiet hours that followed, between nurses checking vitals and doctors speaking in careful tones, Frank had nothing to do but think. He thought about the cost of this war, how much of himself he'd already spent, the sleepless nights, the strain on Angela, the way his world had narrowed to court filings and accusations. Was this what victory looked like? Olivia came the next afternoon. She stood at the foot of the bed, hands folded, concern carefully arranged on her face. "I never wanted this," she said softly. "I hope you know that." Frank turned his head toward her, eyes sharp despite the weakness in his chest. "You wanted control," he replied. "This is just the part you didn't plan for." She took a step closer. "We can still fix this. Let it go. Focus on healing." Frank shook his head slowly. "You don't get forgiveness by asking for peace after causing the damage." Her expression tightened, the mask slipping just enough. She said nothing more, turning and leaving the room without another word. That evening, Kyle called. His voice cracked through the phone. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have handled things differently." Frank closed his eyes, listening for something beneath the apology. Fear, guilt, or just panic now that consequences felt real. "You're sorry I got hurt," Frank said. "Not sorry for what you did." Kyle hesitated. "I was trying to help." "No," Frank replied quietly. "You were trying to avoid conflict." The call ended without resolution, the distance between them wider than ever. The doctors were clear. Stress would kill him if he didn't stop. Rest wasn't optional. Recovery wasn't a suggestion. Frank nodded through their warnings, but his mind was already elsewhere. Unfinished business pressed harder than pain. The idea of stepping back now, of letting the narrative stand, felt unbearable. Angela finally lost her patience. "You almost died," she said, voice breaking. "And you're still talking about court dates." "If I stop now," Frank answered, "this was all for nothing." She turned away, torn between fear and loyalty, between protecting her husband and saving what remained of her son. It was Rachel who brought the final blow. She arrived quietly, pulling a chair close to the bed. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I should have seen it sooner." She laid out the pattern. Messages, conversations, how Olivia had framed every delay, every disagreement, as proof of Frank's instability, how she'd positioned herself as the steady voice Kyle needed to hear. "She's been steering him," Rachel said. From the start, Frank felt something cold settle in his chest, deeper than anger. This wasn't just betrayal, it was orchestration. Kyle hadn't just failed him. He'd been guided there. As Rachel left, Frank stared at his hands resting on the thin hospital blanket. They looked older now, frailer. But his resolve hadn't weakened. It had sharpened, because now he understood the full truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be healed with time. It was a calculated dismantling. And lying there, heart bruised but still beating, Frank knew one thing with absolute clarity: the fight wasn't over. It had only become unavoidable. Frank returned to his lawyer's office, thinner, slower, but more focused than before. But more focused than before. The heart attack had forced his body to pause, but it hadn't softened his resolve. If anything, it had stripped away hesitation. He listened as his attorney laid out the strategy, page by page, voice firm with preparation. "We have clear evidence," the lawyer said, tapping the file. "Forged signatures, unauthorized transfers. We're moving to formally revoke the power of attorney and challenge every action taken under it." Frank nodded, absorbing the language even when it blurred together. Motions, hearings, affidavits. The law spoke in a dialect that felt deliberately inaccessible, but the meaning underneath was clear. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a legal reckoning. Olivia and Kyle responded within days. Their new attorney was aggressive, polished, and precise. The filing didn't deny the transfers. It reframed them. It painted Frank as medically compromised, emotionally volatile, incapable of managing complex financial decisions after his cardiac event. Reading it made Frank's jaw tighten. "They're using my heart attack as proof I should disappear." "That's exactly what they're doing," his lawyer replied. "It's a common tactic." Frank struggled to keep up as depositions were scheduled and arguments sharpened. The process was relentless, designed to exhaust as much as it was to decide. Some days he wondered if confusion was the point, if the system favored those who could afford to outlast the truth. Rachel met him for coffee one afternoon, her expression careful. "Frank, I have to ask this," she said. "Would you consider a settlement?" He looked at her, surprised. "You think I should walk away?" "I think you should consider your health," she replied. "You could secure enough to live comfortably and avoid the risk." Frank stared out the window, watching people pass by, unaware of the quiet war unfolding behind closed doors. "And what do they learn if I do that?" Rachel didn't answer right away. "I lose more than money if I settle," Frank continued. "I lose the right to say this was wrong." The next hearing left him drained. The judge listened patiently, expression unreadable, as arguments volleyed back and forth. Frank felt small sitting there, his life distilled into exhibits and accusations. At times, it seemed like the narrative Olivia's lawyer presented carried more weight than facts themselves. Angela waited for him at home, concern etched deep into her face. "This is killing you," she said that night. "You don't owe anyone this fight." "I owe it to myself," Frank replied. She shook her head, tears threatening. "I don't want to be a widow because you couldn't let go." The word hit harder than any legal blow. Frank reached for her hand. "If I let this go," he said softly, "I'll still be here, but I won't be whole." He felt trapped between two losses, his health and his dignity. The system didn't care which one he chose. That night, alone again, Frank reviewed the filings one last time. He saw how easily age was weaponized, how concern became accusation, how truth bent under pressure when power leaned hard enough. Something settled inside him then, not anger, not fear, but clarity. This wasn't about accounts or properties anymore. It was about whether he would accept being rewritten while still alive. The next morning, Frank called his lawyer. "No settlement," he said. "We go all the way." As he hung up, his chest ached not with pain, but with the weight of the choice. He didn't know how much strength he had left. Only that surrender would cost him more than the fight ever could. And for Frank Mitchell, dignity was the one thing he refused to sign away. The documents arrived in a plain envelope, delivered to Frank's lawyer's office without explanation. No return address, no note, just paper cold, precise, devastating. Frank sat at the conference table as his lawyer slid the copies toward him. At first glance, they looked like everything else he'd seen for months. Forms, agreements, authorizations. But then he noticed the dates, the sequence, the subtle repetition of his name where it shouldn't have been, his signature, again, and again, and again. Not one mistake, a pattern. "These weren't part of the original discovery," his lawyer said quietly. "They show up across 3 institutions. Same handwriting, same pressure marks, same forgery." Frank felt a hollow open in his chest, deeper than anger. This wasn't improvisation. This was planning. Time spent practicing his name. Time spent assuming he'd never notice or never be believed. When he left the office, he didn't go home. He drove aimlessly, hands steady on the wheel, while something inside him unraveled. Every memory of Olivia's calm voice replayed differently now. Every reassurance reclassified as strategy. He confronted her 2 days later, in the kitchen. Sunlight spilling across the counter like nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. "These are yours," Frank said, placing the copies down. "All of them." Olivia barely glanced at the pages. "I don't know what you think you're seeing. You signed my name," Frank said, "on multiple documents." She sighed, the sound edged with irritation rather than fear. "You're misinterpreting paperwork you don't fully understand. That's been the problem from the start." The dismissal cut clean. "I understand my own signature." "You understand stress," she replied, "and confusion, and the need to feel in control when things are slipping." Frank stared at her, searching for a crack. There was none, just composure, calculation, the certainty that denial was safer than truth. Kyle stood near the doorway, silent as ever. Frank turned to him. "You knew," Frank said. Kyle's shoulders slumped. "I didn't want to make things worse, so you let her keep going." Kyle looked away. "I thought it would stop. I thought it was temporary." Frank nodded slowly, the weight of it pressing down now in full. Silence hadn't just enabled betrayal. It had protected it. His son hadn't forged the signatures, but he'd guarded the lie. That night, Frank sat alone in the dark, the house filled with echoes of conversations that had never been honest. He felt grief more than rage. Grief for the trust he'd given freely. Grief for the man he thought Kyle was becoming. Grief for the family he thought he still had. Rachel called the next morning. "We have enough to expose this publicly," she said. "Legally and socially. It changes the pressure." Frank closed his eyes. Going public meant escalation. It meant headlines with names attached. It meant family members choosing sides. It meant no more pretending this could be handled quietly. "You need to consider it," Rachel continued. "Silence protects her." Frank thought of holidays, of shared tables, of the way Olivia had once called him Dad, with practiced warmth. Exposing the truth wouldn't just damage her, it would fracture what remained of the family. Later that day, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through messages from relatives who'd stopped reaching out. Cousins, old friends. People who'd only heard one version of the story. He realized then that Olivia hadn't just taken his authority. She'd taken control of the narrative. Frank straightened in his chair, resolve settling in where hesitation had lived too long. The truth was already costing him. Hiding it wouldn't make it cheaper. He gathered the documents into a single folder and closed it carefully. Whatever came next would hurt. Relationships would burn. Doors would close. But for the first time since this began, Frank felt something solid beneath his feet. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was preparing. And the truth, once revealed, wouldn't be able to hide again. The discovery didn't come from a dramatic revelation or a confession. It came from numbers that no longer lined up. Frank sat with his lawyer and a forensic accountant in a quiet office, listening as properties were listed one by one. A vacation condo, a small commercial building he'd bought years ago as a long-term hold, portions of an investment portfolio he'd rarely touched, sold, the accountant said calmly. Liquidated. Transferred. Frank leaned forward. I didn't authorize any of this. The accountant nodded. The sales were executed under authority granted through the power of attorney. Proceeds were moved through intermediary accounts. The room felt suddenly airless. This wasn't about management anymore. This was extraction. By the time Frank left the meeting, the word betrayal felt inadequate. Olivia hadn't just positioned herself to control his life. She'd begun dismantling it, quietly converting years of work into cash she could move and hide. His lawyer didn't soften the truth. This is fraud and misappropriation. We can file criminal complaints and expand the civil case immediately. Frank didn't answer right away. He thought of the restraint he'd shown so far, the chances he'd given, the hope, thin but persistent, that something human still existed beneath Olivia's precision. That hope was gone now. Kyle reached out that evening, asking to meet. When he arrived, he looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence he'd worn for months. She's going too far, Kyle said, not meeting Frank's eyes. I didn't know about the asset sales. Not all of them. Frank studied his son's face, searching for sincerity through the damage. You're warning me now? Kyle swallowed. She's desperate. She thinks if she controls enough, she can force a settlement. Or break you. The words confirmed what Frank already knew. This wasn't panic. It was strategy. I should have stopped her earlier, Kyle added quietly. I see that now. Frank felt a familiar ache, pride and grief colliding. Guilt didn't erase complicity, but it revealed fear. He confronted Olivia the next day. She didn't deny the sales. She reframed them. I was stabilizing, she said coolly. You were hemorrhaging value with delays and legal exposure. You sold my property, Frank replied. Without consent. I had authority, Olivia said. You signed it. Frank laughed once, short and bitter. You forged half of it. Her eyes hardened. Be careful. Or what? Frank asked. She leaned closer, voice dropping. You think the media's been bad? I can make it worse. I can make you look reckless, vindictive, unhinged. People already believe it. There it was, the threat stripped bare. Frank felt the final thread snap not into rage, but clarity. Fear had been her leverage, silence her shield. It wouldn't work anymore. I'm filing everything, Frank said. Fraud, theft, every sale. Olivia smiled thinly. Then I'll burn what's left of your reputation. Frank turned away without another word. The conversation was over because the illusion was gone. That night, alone in his study, Frank felt the full weight of what had been taken, not just assets, but time, peace, trust. The comfort of believing his family would never become his adversary. He felt betrayed, deeply, permanently, but beneath it all, something steadier remained. Determination. They had mistaken his patience for weakness, his age for fragility, his love for leverage. Frank began signing documents, not the kind Olivia had used against him, but ones that reclaimed ground, criminal referrals, emergency injunctions, asset freezes. Each signature felt different now, clear, intentional. He wasn't trying to save the family anymore. He was saving himself. And as the machinery of consequence began to turn, Frank knew the cost would be high. Relationships would be destroyed. Lines would be crossed that could never be uncrossed. But for the first time since this nightmare began, the direction was his again. Whatever Olivia planned next, it would meet a man who was done being dismantled piece by piece and ready to take his life back, no matter who stood in the way. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, quiet and procedural, but it felt like a line drawn in permanent ink. Frank sat beside his lawyer as the final documents were submitted, claims laid out plainly, damages itemized, demands unmistakable. The return of stolen assets. Full accounting. Accountability. There was no satisfaction in it, only necessity. Olivia's response came quickly and predictably. Her legal team didn't focus on the money. They focused on Frank. The filing painted him as unstable, impaired by stress and illness, incapable of sound judgment. It referenced his heart attack, his age, his emotional volatility. The implication was clear. This lawsuit wasn't justice, it was confusion wearing anger. Frank read the document slowly, each sentence landing like a calculated insult. He'd expected resistance. What unsettled him was how easily the system allowed character to be questioned when facts became inconvenient. That night, alone in his bedroom, he felt the doubt creep in. His chest still ached some mornings. Fatigue lingered longer than it should have. He wondered quietly, honestly, if he had the strength to see this through. Winning in court required stamina, time, clarity, all things his body had recently betrayed. The next call surprised him. Kyle asked to meet. When his son arrived, he looked different, unarmed, stripped of defensiveness. They sat across from each other in silence before Kyle spoke. "I need to say this without excuses," Kyle said. "I was wrong." Frank didn't respond. "I knew about the forgery," Kyle continued. "Not all of it, but enough. And I stayed quiet because it was easier than standing up to her, easier than standing up to you." Frank felt the words press against old wounds. "Why now?" he asked. Kyle swallowed. "Because I see what this has cost you. And because I don't want to be that man anymore." Remorse didn't erase damage, but it mattered. Kyle agreed to cooperate to provide records, messages, timelines, not as an act of reconciliation, but responsibility. When Frank told his lawyer, the shift was immediate. Evidence once circumstantial began to connect. Transaction trails sharpened. Testimony gained weight. For the first time in months, momentum changed direction. As filings were updated and motions revised, Frank felt something unfamiliar return confidence. Not the loud kind, the quiet assurance that truth, when fully assembled, carried force. Sitting in the lawyer's office, weeks later, reviewing the expanded case, Frank realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. This fight wasn't about recovering losses. It was about refusing erasure. Every argument Olivia made about his instability relied on one assumption: that dignity diminished with age, that illness nullified truth, that persistence looked like delusion when it came from the wrong person. Frank wouldn't allow that story to stand. When Angela asked him one evening if he was sure, really sure, he wanted to keep going, Frank answered without hesitation. "I have to finish this," he said. "Not because I'm angry, because I deserve to be seen clearly." The decision settled in him like resolve rather than resistance. He would see the lawsuit through, to court, to verdict, to whatever ending waited on the other side, because surrender would confirm every lie told about him. And Frank Mitchell had reached the point where walking away would cost him more than staying in the fight ever could. The turning point wasn't the filing. It was the moment he stopped wondering whether he could endure and decided that he must. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. Frank sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes forward, listening as weeks of testimony narrowed into minutes of closing arguments. Every document, every accusation, every fracture in his family now depended on how 12 strangers would understand the truth. His lawyer stood first. She spoke without theatrics, letting the evidence do the work. Forged signatures projected onto a screen. Transaction trails mapped cleanly from Frank's accounts to unauthorized sales. Timelines that showed intent, not confusion. She didn't ask the jury to feel sorry for Frank. She asked them to see him clearly. "This case isn't about age," she said. "It's about consent." And consent was taken. Frank felt his pulse steady as she spoke. For the first time in months, the story sounded whole. Then Olivia's lawyer rose. His tone shifted the room. Slower, concerned, almost gentle. He spoke of decline, of stress, of a man overwhelmed by change and unwilling to accept help. He referenced the heart attack, the media coverage, the family's concern for Frank's well-being. "At some point," the lawyer said, "we must ask whether Mr. Mitchell was capable of understanding the decisions before him." The implication cut deeper than accusation. Frank stared straight ahead, jaw tight, feeling decades of competence reduced to a question mark. Then something unexpected happened. Kyle stood. The room stirred as he was sworn in. Frank turned slowly, dread blooming in his chest. Kyle's face was pale, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the witness stand. "I need to say this," Kyle began, voice unsteady. "I knew what was happening." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Kyle swallowed hard. "I knew Olivia was signing documents for my father. I didn't stop her. I benefited from it, and I stayed silent." Frank's breath caught. "There's no excuse," Kyle continued. "I told myself I was helping, but I was protecting myself." The words landed like a physical blow. Frank felt the devastation surge raw, immediate, but he didn't look away. This wasn't the son he'd hoped to reconcile with. This was a man choosing truth too late. Olivia's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Kyle finished quickly, eyes never once meeting Frank's. When he stepped down, the room felt altered. The line between defense and denial had collapsed. Frank sat perfectly still, grief and pride colliding inside him. This admission strengthened the case, but it ended something else forever. He understood that now with brutal clarity. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. Minutes stretched into hours. Frank paced the hallway once, then sat again, exhaustion pressing down harder than fear. He thought of everything that had led here: the quiet dinner, the forged signatures, the hospital bed. He wondered whether winning would feel like relief or just another kind of loss. Finally, the bailiff called them back. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. Frank's lawyer leaned toward him. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you were heard." The foreperson stood. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." Frank's chest loosened, not in triumph, but release. Control of his finances restored. Assets ordered returned. Fraud acknowledged. He had won. But as the courtroom emptied, Frank remained seated. Kyle stood across the room, frozen, unable to approach. Olivia had already turned away. Victory felt quieter than he'd imagined. Frank gathered his papers slowly, aware that while the law had given him back his life, it couldn't give him back his son. As he walked out of the courtroom, sunlight spilling across the steps outside, one truth followed him with unwavering clarity. Justice had been served, but the cost had been permanent, and the aftermath was only just beginning. The silence after the verdict felt heavier than the months of noise that had come before it. Frank woke each morning expecting urgency, phone calls, filings, deadlines, but instead there was only space. Time to think. Time to feel what the fight had taken from him. He noticed it in small ways. The fatigue that lingered even after a full night's sleep. The way his chest tightened not from pain, but memory, whenever he passed the study where he'd collapsed. Victory hadn't erased the cost. It had only ended the bleeding. The news of Olivia's arrest came quietly, almost anticlimactic. Fraud, financial misappropriation. The words looked clinical on the page, stripped of the damage they represented. Frank felt no satisfaction reading them. Only a dull confirmation that the woman who had dismantled his life had finally been stopped. But consequences didn't rewind time. Kyle came by a week later, standing awkwardly in the doorway like a guest unsure of his welcome. His confidence was gone now, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Kyle said, voice low, "but I needed you to hear this from me. I'm sorry." Frank listened without interruption. He wanted to believe the remorse was real. Parts of it were. But regret didn't undo months of silence, or the moment in court when truth had finally outweighed loyalty. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Frank said honestly. "Not yet." Kyle nodded, tears in his eyes, accepting the answer he'd earned. When he left, the house felt emptier than before, but also quieter, like a wound finally exposed to air. Angela stayed close through it all. She didn't push Frank toward healing or reconciliation. She simply sat with him, shared meals, held his hand when the grief came in waves. Together, they mourned something that had never been written down the family they thought they had. "We'll never get that version back," Angela said one evening. Frank nodded. "No, but we can choose what comes next." Slowly, Frank began the work of rebuilding. Not the finances, that part was procedural. Lawyers handled accounts. Advisors restored order. What needed rebuilding was himself. He started walking again. Short distances at first, then farther. He returned to habits he'd abandoned: reading in the evenings, calling old friends, sitting in silence without needing to solve anything. Each small routine felt like reclaiming territory. Sometimes, alone in the quiet, he thought about the rest of his life. The years ahead that no longer belonged to obligation or expectation. The question wasn't how to fix what was broken, but how to live without letting it harden him. He understood now that betrayal didn't just take things from you. It tried to define you by what you lost. Frank refused that. One morning, standing in the backyard as the sun rose, he felt something unfamiliar but welcome: resolve without anger. He would carry the scars, but they would not steer him. His story wouldn't end at the moment he was wronged. It would continue because he chose it to. The road ahead was uncertain. Forgiveness, if it came, would take time. Trust might never fully return. But Frank Mitchell was still standing, still deciding. And for the first time since that dinner table night, his life belonged to him again, not as a reaction to betrayal, but as a deliberate choice to move forward on his own terms. Rebuilding didn't come with a plan or a timeline. It arrived in fragments, short conversations, cautious gestures, long pauses where neither Frank nor Kyle knew what to say. They met for coffee once a week, always in the same quiet place. No lawyers, no agendas, just two men learning how to exist in the same space again. At first, they talked about neutral things, work, weather, nothing that required trust. Frank listened more than he spoke, watching his son closely, measuring sincerity in the spaces between words. Progress wasn't dramatic. It was slow enough to feel invisible. Angela and Frank were learning too. Evenings that once ended in silence now carried conversation again, though the weight of what had been lost lingered between them. They didn't pretend the scars weren't there. Healing, they understood, didn't mean forgetting it, meant choosing not to bleed onto each other anymore. For Frank, the days began to open up in unexpected ways. Without the constant pull of crisis, he found himself exploring ideas he'd shelved years ago, consulting work that challenged him without consuming him, volunteering with a local mentorship program, offering guidance to men who reminded him of Kyle, ambitious, uncertain, hungry for direction. The work gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time, purpose without pressure. Kyle, meanwhile, struck out on his own. No shortcuts, no family safety net. He started small, working long hours, making mistakes he couldn't outsource. Sometimes he called Frank not for money, but perspective. "What would you do here?" Kyle asked once, frustration edging his voice. Frank paused before answering. "I'd slow down," he said, "and own the outcome." Those calls mattered more than apologies. Over time, Frank began to notice changes. Kyle listened differently now, took responsibility without deflecting. The growth was real, but trust, Frank knew, had to be earned repeatedly, not assumed. He remained cautious, present, open, but not blind. One afternoon, while walking alone, Frank thought about legacy. For years, he'd measured it in numbers and assets, in what he could pass down. Now, standing in the quiet, he understood something deeper. Legacy wasn't what survived you. It was how you lived while you were here. He had shown his son what accountability looked like, what boundaries meant, what dignity cost. That mattered more than any inheritance. As months passed, the sharpness of the past softened, not erased but integrated. Frank accepted that redemption wasn't a moment. It was a practice, one that required patience from both sides. Sitting across from Kyle one morning, Frank saw not the boy he'd raised, or the man who'd betrayed him, but someone becoming something else, someone unfinished. And that was enough. As they parted that day, Frank felt a quiet certainty settle in. The future didn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. It only needed honesty. They had time, not to forget but to heal. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Frank felt something steady beneath his feet. A new beginning, slow, fragile, and real. The conversation happened without ceremony. No raised voices, no rehearsed apologies. Just Frank and Kyle sitting on a park bench, watching late afternoon light stretch across the grass. "I think about what I did every day," Kyle said quietly. "I don't expect you to forget it." Frank nodded. "I won't," he replied. "But I don't want to live inside it either." That was the agreement, not forgiveness, not absolution, but movement. Forward, together, at a pace that didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. At home, Frank and Angela began to reclaim the space they'd nearly lost. Mornings stretched longer, dinners lingered. They talked about things that had nothing to do with courtrooms or family fractures. Sometimes they said very little at all, content in the shared silence. It wasn't the marriage they'd had before. It was something more deliberate, more honest. Frank found himself drawn to the small rhythms of life, walking without checking his phone, reading in the evening while Angela cooked, sitting on the porch as neighbors passed, anonymous and unconcerned with his history. Peace, he realized, didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as permission. Kyle continued working, building something of his own without shortcuts. He showed up early, stayed late. When problems arose, he didn't deflect. He handled them, Frank noticed, not with judgment, but attention. One evening, Kyle asked to talk. "I've been offered a partnership," he said. "It's risky, but it's mine." Frank studied him for a long moment. The instinct to protect flared and then settled. "Why are you telling me?" Frank asked. "Because I want to do this right," Kyle said. "And because your opinion matters." Frank felt the weight of the request. Blessing wasn't approval. It was trust. "I can't promise. I won't worry," Frank said finally. "But I won't stand in your way." Kyle nodded, relief softening his face. As the weeks passed, Frank noticed something shift inside himself. The anger that once sharpened every memory had dulled. Not gone, but no longer in control. Forgiveness, he understood, wasn't an event. It was a series of choices made quietly, often without recognition. And it required time. Standing in the backyard one evening, watching the sky darken, Frank felt hope stir, tentative, but real. Healing wasn't guaranteed. Trust might always carry caution, but the future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt possible. And for Frank Mitchell, that possibility was enough to keep going one deliberate step at a time. The air between Frank and Kyle felt different now. Not light, not easy, but honest. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold, as neither seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. There was no need to revisit details. They both knew the terrain they'd crossed. "We lost a lot," Kyle said finally. "But we didn't lose everything," Frank nodded slowly. "And we learned what matters, sometimes the hard way." They spoke about the past without circling it, about mistakes without defending them. Pain was acknowledged, not dissected. Progress wasn't celebrated, it was respected. That, Frank realized, was what healing actually looked like. Later that evening, Frank stood with Angela on the back porch, the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling in around them. She leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're different," she said. "So are we," Frank replied. They'd both changed, softer in some places, stronger in others. The chaos that once dominated their days had been replaced by intention. They chose each other now, not out of habit, but awareness. Frank thought back to the months he'd spent fighting through courtrooms, headlines, hospital walls. The cost had been immense, but standing there, grounded and present, he knew the battle had been worth it. Not for the verdict, for the clarity. Kyle joined them, carrying a small box. "I wanted to show you something," he said, opening it to reveal a framed document, his first official business registration. "It's not much," Kyle added quickly. "But it's honest." Frank studied it, then looked up at his son. "That's how it starts." Kyle exhaled, relief clear in his expression. "I wouldn't be here without everything that happened. Even the worst parts." Frank felt the weight of those words settle not as guilt, but acknowledgement. Family, he realized, wasn't defined by perfection or unbroken trust. It was defined by accountability, by the willingness to confront failure and still choose growth. They shared a simple dinner that night. No speeches, no tension, just conversation and laughter that came easier than it had in years. It wasn't a celebration of what they'd overcome, but of what they were building. As the evening wound down, Frank felt something close to closure. Not an ending, but a release. The past no longer demanded resolution. It had been faced, learned from. Standing alone before bed, Frank looked at his reflection and saw a man marked by experience, not diminished by it. He felt ready, not certain, not fearless, but open. The future no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a path. And for the first time in a long while, Frank stepped forward without looking back, carrying hope not as a promise but as a choice he was prepared to make every day. The walk was unplanned. Frank and Kyle found themselves side by side on the familiar trail behind the neighborhood, the one Frank used to take when his thoughts needed room to breathe. The air was cool, the light soft, neither of them rushing to fill the quiet. "I didn't understand what you were protecting back then," Kyle said after a while. "I thought control meant security." Frank nodded, eyes on the path ahead. "And I thought trust meant never questioning the people you love." They walked a few more steps, each carrying the weight of lessons learned too late, but learned nonetheless. The past wasn't erased by movement, but it no longer anchored them in place. When they stopped near the bend in the trail, Frank turned to his son. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he said, "but it's the only way to heal. Not for the other person, for yourself." Kyle swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. I won't forget that. That evening, the family gathered around a modest dinner table. No formalities, no speeches. Just food passed by hand and conversation that didn't flinch when the past brushed against it. Angela watched them quietly, her expression a mixture of relief and caution. Healing, she knew, wasn't linear, but it was happening. As they ate, Frank felt something settle into place. Love, he realized, wasn't blind acceptance. It was boundary and choice. Trust earned slowly. Care offered without surrendering self-respect. The family before him wasn't whole in the way it once had been. It was different, scarred, reshaped, more honest. And that, Frank understood, was not a failure. It was survival. Later, as the evening faded, Frank stepped outside alone. He thought about legacy, not as wealth passed down, but as principles lived out. Resilience, accountability, the courage to confront betrayal without becoming it. He felt hope, not loud or triumphant, but steady, the kind that didn't deny pain, yet refused to be ruled by it. When Kyle joined him at the door, Angela close behind, Frank didn't hesitate. They walked forward together, not because everything was fixed, but because they were willing to keep choosing each other with open eyes. The future waited, uncertain and unfinished. And Frank Mitchell stepped into it knowing this much for certain. His story would not be defined by what was taken from him, but by what he chose to give back. Forgiveness, boundaries, and the quiet strength to keep walking.